I'd like to introduce Ro, who's going to speak to us. I've known Ro for, I think, about 15 or so years, and she's worked for a long time on group engagement with climate change. And in particular, she's the inventor of Carbon Conversations, which is a program really based on psychotherapeutic techniques for working in groups, enabling people to talk about climate change and to work towards making changes in their lives and actions. Actually, I'll say Ro's also very involved in something in the UK called Climate Psychology Alliance, and I encourage you to look that up on the web. There's lots of really interesting material on their website, and also if you look up Ro's website, there are a lot of her articles. So I encourage you to follow up after her talk by reading some of her writings. So do go ahead, Ro.
Thank you, Laurie. Next slide, thank you. I've always found the term behaviour change a sticking point for myself, and I prefer to think about personal change, because I know very few people who talk about themselves in terms of their behaviour, and so it sits a bit strangely with people when you tell them that you want them to change their behaviour. And I find it much more helpful to think about the whole person and the idea of personal change. And I found that appeals to people much more. And so I think we need to think about people in their total context, think about them emotionally, intellectually, their ideas, spiritually, their beliefs and values, what's possible for them physically, what their social circumstances are, what their political views might be, their culture, their economic situation, all of these things which make each of us up as a person. And I think once we start doing that, once we take a little step away from the behaviour, which is the thing we hope might actually change, and start to look at people in the round, we're actually on the way to being able to talk much more effectively about the things which matter. And I'd like to go on to talk about people's reactions when they hear about climate change. And I think mostly when people hear the news, it's to feel shock. And often there's a very quick reaction to the left-hand side of this slide, to this, what I call disavowal or denial. And disavowal is a term which psychotherapists use to describe the capacity of the human mind to hold two completely different things there at the same time. So to hold the idea that yes, climate change is happening, but to put it in a box where you don't really have to think about it at all. And I think this is a state which a lot of people are in with climate change. And so when they're reminded of it by somebody coming along and saying perhaps that they ought to do something about it, or they ought not to do some of the things which they are doing, they become defensive. And often the conversation apparently takes place on a factual, rational level. But it's not really that's not really what's going on, because when people are reminded about climate change, they feel uncomfortable all over again. They may feel frightened, and they may feel very, very powerless. And the kinds of things which you find people will say, they say, well, there's nothing I can do. It's not my fault. I'm too small to make a difference. It's not my responsibility. It's government that ought to do something. Or they say it's too late. And so I don't see why I shouldn't just enjoy myself in the time that we've got left. And the end result of this, of course, is that life goes on as usual. And so people who are perfectly aware of what's happening with climate change don't actually alter their lives personally or get involved politically or do even the smallest actions which they might be able to do. Because, of course, doing that reminds you again that climate change is on the agenda. So it's difficult, it's quite difficult knowledge to stay with. And I think the opposite route that somebody can take is acknowledgement. And sometimes what happens there is you find that people just immerse themselves in all the awful facts. And that is a stage which really does need to be left behind after a point. Because if you stay with the awful facts, you just become a kind of obsessive, fear-mongering, disaster-talking bundle of bad news. And so you need to move to the next stage, which is this painful acceptance that there is a new reality, that a lot of the things which maybe you thought were going to happen in your life may not be able to happen in the way that you'd hoped. So if you're young and you longed to travel the world, that may be off the agenda if you are really going to do something about climate change. And so there's a process of deciding how you're going to live and what you're going to do, what it is actually in your power to do. And so where we want to move people to is to this right-hand side of acknowledgement and away from this left-hand side of disavowal or denial. And I think that this is really the tricky part of things, because there are a lot of things which make it difficult. And often you find that people are in fact moving backwards and forwards between these two states. So they're not smooth trajectories that once you start on one, that's where you are forever. And even those of us who have truly accepted that climate change is happening and it's very, very serious, will go back into the other state at times. So what makes this acknowledgement and action easier? One of the things is obviously the infrastructure and systems which make it easy to be a good citizen. This phrase is actually from a man who was a traffic engineer called Eric Claxton, who designed the road system in a new town in the UK called Stevenage. And he made the lay-bys where the buses pulled in extra big. And this meant that the drivers could pull off easily and not disrupt the traffic instead of sort of stopping half on the side of the road, which is what they used to do. And he called this designing things to make it easy to be a good citizen, so that people didn't have to think twice about it. And this is something which in most countries in the world doesn't exist at the moment. All of the infrastructure and systems make it easy to be a bad citizen on the whole. We're encouraged to, have jobs a long way from where we live. The food that we buy is heavily processed and packaged. We're encouraged in the West to fly away on holiday. All of these things make it very difficult. And so the people who I think that you are all talking to are people who are going to try to go against the grain of these systems. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that this is hard, because if you don't acknowledge that it's hard to go against these systems, you'll find that people will just say, oh, well, I can't do that because, and they will quote the fact that the buses don't run, or that there's nothing else to eat in the supermarket that's cheap, or something of that kind. So you need to acknowledge that. The other things which we've found in my work, and I think in other people's work too, is having values and beliefs which support sustainability. So these may come from a faith tradition, they may come from a sense of social responsibility, they may come from a love of the natural world. There are a whole range of values which people may have which will support sustainability. And in the Carbon Conversations groups, we found it very important to explore those, to help people talk about what it is that they feel is important in life, which means that they want to do this. And the third thing is solidarity, having a peer group which offers you social and emotional support, which sort of keeps you in that space where you're going against the grain of what society tells you you really ought to be doing, or what's easiest to do. So those are three things which I would talk about, is acknowledging how difficult it is, holding on to and exploring the beliefs which will support it, and having the group around you who are going to help. One of the other areas of my work has been thinking about what happens when you first start to try to talk to somebody about climate change who hasn't really got it on the top of their agenda and who is hoping that it might all go away and be looked after by somebody else. And I always say to people that it's best to try to concentrate not on the content of the conversation, but on its process. So the content of the conversation can be anything. It might be climate change, but it could equally be me talking to my husband about what we're going to have for supper. But there is a way in which that conversation goes on. I may be irritated, he may be irritated, I may be feeling very busy, I may be thinking he's rather lazy, I may be cross about something else, and the whole conversation will go along on those lines. Or we may be getting on very well and we'll have a nice kind of friendly conversation about it. So in this process, there's often a lot going on which isn't on the surface and isn't to do with the content. So I think if you want to talk about climate change, try to concentrate on what's happening, on how people are feeling, how they're reacting, how they're seeing each other, what seems to be getting in the way. And one of the things which I often think helps is to start by acknowledging how difficult this subject is. So being able to say, for instance, if you've called a meeting, that you might start by saying that you've called this meeting to talk about something which you know that most people find very difficult, and that you want to thank people for coming and opening themselves up to talking about something difficult. So this is maybe your guess at the first piece of empathy that you might need to show, which is that people are likely to feel worried, afraid, or whatever. But more important than that is you need to be trying to follow in the conversation. What is it that they're feeling? What are they experiencing? What kind of circumstances do they live in? What sort of things might be possible for them, and what are going to be impossible? Because people can sometimes feel quite desperate if they think that they're being asked to do something which they simply can't do. Their job is a 15-mile commute away and they can only get there by car. They can't change that instantly. And so they will begin to feel guilty, panicked, angry at you for suggesting they might do something they can't do. So it's important to stay empathic with the other person or the group that you're trying to talk to. I think the other thing is to understand is that people always feel ambivalent about change. So there'll be something that's pushing you towards the change, and there'll be something that's holding you back. And so being able to work with that feeling that somebody would like to, but, and being able to explore both sides of that. It doesn't help if you just counter it. And often when we talk about climate change, we counter with facts. We say, oh, the bus timetables are much better now. You can get the bus, without actually exploring what that person's ambivalence is about. And inevitably in a conversation, you'll come up against resistance. And often you experience this emotionally long before anybody's said that they're not interested. You'll feel them sort of shifting, they move away, their eyes look down, their eyes look somewhere else, they begin to fidget, or they start to treat you in a particular way that you feel isn't you. They might treat you as if you're an authority figure telling them off, their mum saying that they ought to, brush their teeth every morning or something. And so you can feel trapped in a little tiny space that you can't get out of. And so again, what helps is to try to open up the conversation, to say, I don't think you're liking what I'm telling you, or to say, it sounds like you're really uncomfortable with this idea, and so on. And as you do that, you make space for the person to talk about what they feel, and then they explore it. You're not pushing them, they explore it. So you go with the resistance in some way. And the other thing is to see what you can do to help people develop a sense of agency. What is there that they can do? What is going to make them feel better? It may not be the same thing that you do. You may say, oh, I've given up flying, I don't fly anywhere anymore. But if they've got relatives in another part of the world, then that's probably not an option. So you need to try to work with them around the things which they can do, and also around the things which you can do together. You may collectively decide that you're going to hold a demonstration, or collectively that you're going to go and do some leafleting, or collectively that you're going to write to a member of parliament or somebody in authority. And that can often give people a strong feeling of agency. And finally, I would say always pick your time and place. The best time for a difficult conversation is not when somebody's just rushing out the door, getting their shoes on, trying to make supper, put the kids to bed, and so on. So pick your time and place for when you have the conversations. I'm sure I've taken longer than I was supposed to, but that's roughly it.
Thank you. That was great.
And now we have quite some participants who have questions and feedback to what you have just shared. May I share some of the summary of questions with you?
Sure.
Great. So one concern by many people is what are the barriers to change? Some have expressed that through their personal experience, but what have you recognized? Yeah, are they kind of main barriers to change?
I think there's a feeling that it's very hard to go against the culture of the group that you're part of. So, for example, if conversations at work are all about where people have been on holiday and they've all been flying somewhere, and they turn to you and they say, oh, so where did you go this year? And you say, well, I went to, somewhere very close to home. You feel awkward. They feel as if they've said something wrong, and they will then feel, if you explain, they may well feel criticized. So there is that in the personal relationship of the group. It can be quite tricky to find a good way of saying what you want to say without it being taken in the wrong way. And so I would suggest there that people rehearse it, role play it, try having a conversation where somebody is, taking the part of the person where it's all gone wrong. Look back, think about where it went wrong. So that's a very personal one. I think the other thing is that there are the real barriers in the infrastructure that you're going to try and go against. And I think that has a lot to do with maybe talking about finding the group that you might want to work with politically about change to infrastructure and systems, and thinking what you can do as an organization that might challenge those systems. So if there's a consultation about local transport in your area, can you take part? Can you, put the point of view that you want to put? So finding ways to work with those actual barriers that really exist, that are much bigger than the individual. I think that's important.
Thank you very much. It's leading already into that next question. What can help to remember and practice new behaviors or those changes?
Right. I think with little things, somebody once told me it takes 37 times of doing something before you actually do it automatically. I have no idea if that's true, but I think it expresses a feeling about it. So if you're trying to do, say, a small thing like turning off the lights or only putting enough water in the kettle for a cup of tea, these are very tiny actions which don't make a big difference, but they're part of it. I think the thing is not to criticize yourself when you get it wrong, or just to remind yourself that it takes a lot of persistence. And where it's something which is actually more difficult, it's often something which requires planning ahead. So supposing you've decided you want to halve your car mileage this year, which is a goal we often have in carbon conversations group, halve your car mileage. You've got to plan. How are you actually going to do it? What does it mean? What are you going to do when it rains and you can't walk or get the bus or the bike or whatever? So trying to plan, I think, is another thing which helps.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful and hands-on as well. Now, on the kind of different categories of changes, of personal changes, since we're all working in faith communities, do you have any insight if it's what's more easy, making easy small changes or difficult big changes?
I think it can be very frustrating if you only concentrate on small changes, because it can remind you of how insignificant these things are. And I think getting the support for big changes can actually feel like you've turned a corner. You are actually living your life differently. So if somebody decides that they're not going to eat meat, which is something which can make a big difference to your carbon footprint, thinking about how you might progress towards that point would be important. So it might be about learning to cook differently. It might be about starting with one meat-free day a week, but it might be having an idea that you want to achieve this in 6 months or a year. So moving towards a big change. Or another one might be deciding, for some families in high-income areas, it may be possible to decide that you're not going to own a car anymore. So working out with other people how you're going to do that, what it means. I think it can feel very satisfying once you've got there. So.
Thank you. I do have 2 more questions from participants.
Sure.
One says, it's a great discussion. We had a great discussion on the powerful slide of denial and acknowledgement. It would be nice to also see another angle, the one of hope. What do you think about that?
Encourage people to look for solidarity from the group. I think that often helps. And to focus on the areas in your life where you can feel joy, which may not be to do with climate change. I think it's very important not to think about climate change all the time, or you would go crazy. So to think about the things which you really like to do, which are still perfectly okay to do. Nothing, having a good time with your friends locally that's not going to cause any harm. Going for a walk in nature, doing your garden, whatever it is that actually gives you pleasure and satisfaction. I think it's really, really important to keep those things going, to look after yourself in those ways.
Thank you very much. The last question that people have discussed in the breakout group is how they would see themselves in accompanying personal change of others, because they're all working in local faith communities. Do you have recommendations for how to accompany people in changes that are? I mean, we've talked about many tips already, but if you would want to add something on that role of facilitating change and inviting others to that.
I think it's very important to feel your way in the relationship that you have with people as a leader. And people have very, very, very different leadership styles. And so my preferred one is a facilitative style, where I am trying to accompany people along the way rather than tell them what to do. And I would always say, be careful with your facts, because I think often we retreat into facts when we're feeling defensive. We hope that we're going to get someone to change by slamming them with the awful truth. And in fact, we're much more likely to get them to change and to stay with the change that they've started on through empathy and encouragement and development of a sense of agency and solidarity together. So I think in the accompaniment of people in change, it's staying with it, and it's being the person who is persistent as well when people are feeling like giving up. It's trying to work out what it is that's making them feel that way and helping them through it.
Thank you very much. And it's also that it's great that you mentioned that how we communicate about sustainable living is so important. And actually our next session of this leadership program will talk about narratives of transformation and how we can communicate about sustainable living. Ro, thank you very much for joining us today.
Carolina, can I ask a couple of questions?
You can also ask a couple. I think we have another 3 minutes left. Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So these are two from me. Maybe I'll ask them both at once. One is about, you talked about agency, you talked about things like going on demonstrations as part of this, and I'd be interested to hear a bit about your experience of how people making personal lifestyle changes has connected with other kinds of agency, with engaging with the political system or whatever. And I'll ask you the other one at the same time, and you can decide how much to spend time on them. And the other one is, and I think it's come up in our session, is about giving people information about the impact of their actions. And I know in Carbon Conversations you've used carbon footprinting, or that kind of data-based information. And I think it'd be really helpful to know how you've experienced people engage with that, and how it's, where it's helpful, maybe where it's unhelpful.
I think it's, I'll do the second question first. When we first started Carbon Conversations, we started by taking a carbon calculator around to lots of public events, and we'd say to people, would you like to know your carbon footprint? Which at the time was a topic of conversation in the press, and so people were curious. And what we found was that people's emotional experience of that was profound. And we had to really work very, very hard at getting our volunteers to be able to handle people's responses, because people felt upset at realizing that their carbon footprint was way off the scale and how serious it was. So we were comparing the sustainable 1.5 tons, which is what figure we've got then, with the kind of 12 to 15 tons that people in the UK had. And being confronted with that information, we had to be very careful how we did it, because people did get upset. Sometimes they would cut off and be angry, but more often they would want to say, I'm sure that's not right. I live a very sustainable life. And you'd have to kind of gently take them through what the answer was. So I think it's all about that personal relationship. I think the numbers are necessary, because if you don't have any numbers, people think that turning the lights off or putting their recycling out is an adequate response. So you do need the numbers, but I think you need to be very careful about how you use them, and what kind of the safety of the space in which you're holding the conversation, and that you're not exposing people or humiliating them by showing that they've got a massive footprint. So that was your first question. The other one was about the connection between the personal and the political, I think, wasn't it? And I think that whether you start from the political or you start from the personal, at some point you're going to find that they collide, because you can't try to reduce your footprint without coming up against the things which need to be done politically. And that may be a piece of local politics, it may be a piece of national politics. And I think it's always much easier to decide to do something when you're talking with other people. And so one of the things which we've seen a lot in the UK, I think, is faith groups on demonstrations, people coming out together with a banner from where they are from to take part. And I think that showing of solidarity can be very effective. I mean, the question's obviously about how effective it is politically, but I think for the people who do it, coming out together to say, we stand for this, we want it to be seen publicly, can be important.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you very much. Great. Rose, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today, for sharing your research, your insights, your experience with our participants of the Sustainable Living Leadership Program. And we look forward to having you again as a speaker one time. Thank you so much. All the best for your work, and great meeting you.